That's why this stuff gets into people's heads and turns in war, because to them it is no less deep than like a sort of like slavery versus free kind of ideology. These are the core American issues.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga, Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le bunga, bunga, Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le bunga, bunga, Lima ou Luxembourg.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to BungaCast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. Today, we're talking about an armed occupation in rural Oregon in 2016, which isn't the standard fare on this podcast, but as long-time listeners may know, 2016 is quite an important year for this podcast, the beginning of the end of history, if that's not too much of a mouthful. This is also about the MAGA coalition, the politics of the radical right in the US, and indeed potential divisions within it, which we've touched on in recent episodes. These are divisions that have been exposed in major ways recently, as I'm sure you, listener, already know, such as between Musk and the tech titans on one hand and Trump on the other, or between true America firsters and nationalists on the one hand and neocon tendencies on the other, as we've seen in recent days over Iran. So I'm Alex Hochuli in São Paulo, Brazil. George Hoare is in London. Hello, George.
Hey.
And I'm very happy to welcome our guest today, James Pogue, who's special correspondent at Vanity Fair and contributing opinion writer at New York Times. And we're going to be talking specifically about a book that George will tell us a little bit more about.
So, today we're talking about James's 2018 book, Chosen Country, A Rebellion in the West. And in this book, James follows the events, as Alex said, surrounding this 2016 armed occupation in, and I will mispronounce this at least once, but I'll try and get it right the first time, in Malheur in Oregon. This is National Wildlife Park in the northwest of the States. And this armed occupation was led by the rancher Ammon Bundy. So, James, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So I think, the first question is basically what happened here. So I guess listeners might vaguely kind of recall this name, Ammon Bundy. 2016, obviously a lot else happened that year. We've tended on this podcast to focus on what happened in June in Britain and in the wider US in November. But maybe take us back to this kind of January, February 2016. What happened in Malheur?
Well, I'll take you back a little farther to start, because the Malheur standoff was kind of the culminating event of a suite of unrest that unfolded in the American West during the latter part, I guess you could say the latter half of the Obama administration, the end of history, this kind of construction. But if people can follow that, basically in 2014, April of 2014, there was a standoff at the Bundy family ranch in southern Nevada. And people probably remember this, probably don't really understand what it was about. And to go into it opens this entire wide door into like how the American regulatory state worked, how certain people involved in productive industries came to feel so alienated as to be virtually violent guerrillas within the borders of this nation. Things like that. We can maybe go further into that later. But the thing to kind of know is that the Bundy family sort of established themselves going back to the 90s as a pole within a movement of people who believed, to quote a rancher who I was just talking to a couple of days ago, that the federal government and the environmental movement were operating a coordinated, I'm quoting here, coordinated genocide against rural people. And Ammon, during this standoff, basically prepared the family for war. They'll talk about it in different terms, but they prepared the family for war. And the FBI and the Bureau of Land Management were willing to bring war. And this gets into very difficult, uncomfortable conversations. But if you look in the internal documents of how people conceived of this family, they've made it very clear they wanted to break and destroy them. And the FBI sent very, very intense surveillance teams and had lasers in their house and stuff like this. They called in the militias and basically won that standoff, long story short. Drove them off, beat them, but they brought more guns to bear than the federal government was willing and able to do. Then in 2015, I went to this thing that nobody ever even covered called the Sugar Pine Mine Standoff, which was the Oath Keepers, the group founded by Stuart Rhodes, who would later go to prison for insurrection. The Oath Keepers kind of led that one, and they had their kind of proving ground originally with the Bundys. And then they started to make in the Northwest a power base of like signal chapters that were kind of the best paramilitary groups they had running. So that was in Josephine County, Oregon, over in southwestern Oregon. And then Ammon, feeling his oats somewhat and feeling the strength of this movement, looked back to these two ranchers who had been sent to federal prison, again, as a result of this kind of long-running, weird, obscure regulatory conflict. And just to catch people up on this, because it never gets reported, the original point of him going to Burns, Oregon, when the standoff begins, was that he was going to assemble an armed force and bust these two ranchers out of prison. He was talked down from that, and somewhat on a whim, he decided, okay, fine, we'll take over this wildlife refuge because there's nobody there. And this was before Trump had won any primaries. It was when Trump still looked like a kook. And so there was this moment, going to the point of this pod, where you could feel cracks in how America was functioning, but you didn't really understand where any of this was going. And it was before it all localized into Trump. So it became a huge outsize event that would have ramifications, I think, going far deeper than a lot of people understood.
Yeah, I think the book definitely makes the case this is an important event in recent American history, and one that I sort of think has been, quite forgotten or overlooked, or maybe just subsumed into later events in a kind of variety of different ways. But I mean, one thing that the book does detail is like your personal involvement. How did you come to be involved in this? Because, there are other books which kind of give a historical account, but you were there.
Right. I mean, this is like the bane of my career, is that let's talk more about this as we go on, actually, because I now have a framework that I did not have as a younger person.
Right.
And honestly, a less historically literate person. I now have a framework that explains why this thing matters. And honestly, like, what is happening just in basic terms that fit into a long running American story.
Okay. Yeah.
And I mention that because fundamentally the divides in American politics right now are between people who descend from a political tradition that derives from Andrew Jackson and people who find that tradition abhorrent and want it excised from American politics. And because I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, just like JD Vance did, I grew up on a basic fault line between Jacksonian America and more cosmopolitan outside of that America. And I grew up in the place where, as Frederick Jackson Turner talks about, was the quote crucible of Jacksonian frontier ideology that would then move west. And so as someone, I can inhabit like a liberal New York cosmopolitan worldview and a Jacksonian worldview like at the same time. And this causes me huge amounts of problems in my life, because I'm always saying to liberals, like, look, like, no, this is what they're saying. It's not, they're coming from this thing and like that's how they see it. And then everybody says that I'm evil and a Fed, or sorry, I mean the right wingers think I'm a Fed because I'm like a liberal, and the left wingers think that I'm like on the side of the militia. And so I have like a thousands upon thousands page FBI file off of my various things, including this, because I met Ammon the first night when I showed up, shortly after they had taken the refuge. I got there, I think, 2 days after. The time blurs. I think it was January 5th, and they went down there the afternoon of the 3rd. And they had read my writing on militias before. And so there were people there who were like, this guy will like explain what we think. Like, even if we don't like him or whatever, he will explain what we think. And that's a big deal to them. And so I was like ushered to meet Ammon and almost got shot, because that was the night that the FBI was supposedly going to raid. And there were all these like drones flying around. And it was a snowstorm. It was very scary. And a guy who I'm still very much in touch with, who ended up going to prison off this stuff, went to try to introduce me to Ammon and knocked on the door. And there was another guy I'm still in touch with who was under orders from Ammon's brother to fire at anyone who came through that door in the little office where they were holed up. And so there was an AR on the other side, and a British reporter named Jonathan Allen, who actually had great access for the time he was there. Jonathan Allen, who's now the Kamala correspondent for, I think, Reuters, and just wrote a book about Kamala. He was sitting there with all the dudes with guns about to shoot me through the other side of the door. And Ammon was leaning back in a chair going, "Isn't it fun to live this way?" I think Jonathan got that quote, which is a great sort of scene that he was able to dredge up. And then I stole. But then subsequent to that, I sort of came to Ammon and was like, I'm a big environmentalist. I sort of come from anarchist stuff. But ranchers like that, like they really, really don't like environmentalists because of that, the way that environmentalists have weaponized the federal government against, honestly, their neighbors a lot of the time, more so than they do. It's just a lot easier to weaponize the federal government against ranchers than it is to weaponize them against Monsanto. And so, unfortunately, the thing that has happened to the environmental movement in the United States is that they win a lot of victories against people they live around and amongst, and they win very few victories against Monsanto or Exxon. And that creates a huge amount of resentment. If you then say this to Ammon, he will like you because he's like, oh, that makes sense. I understand that. You're thinking about this. And so they gave me a huge amount of access and just said, like, you can hang around and shadow us during this standoff that lingered for a long time because the feds were really scared of another Waco. They were really scared of another Ruby Ridge. And they put Mormons, very importantly, a lot of America's internal security services, actually, and external security services, are run by Mormons. And they have a very particular way of doing business. And they are a power base within the FBI, CIA, et cetera. And
So,
go ahead.
yeah, sorry to jump in there, because I did want to ask you a question about Mormonism later, but I just I guess I wanted to kind of recap and so you have this kind of federal government and environmentalists on the one side, and then the kind of rural people on the other, all these ranchers turning up to this nature reserve with lots of guns, the feds kind of lining up on the other side. You're in there, not getting shot. Otherwise, wouldn't be having this conversation.
Right.
So yeah, what happens then? How does this kind of develop, this standoff? How long does it last, and how does it end?
I believe, gosh, it's been a long time. This is fun. I believe it lasted 26 days, all in all. And what we have to kind of dissociate a couple things here, because, and that's sort of why I brought up the Mormon thing, because to the extent to which this standoff does not like explain everything that happened in America the way that a journalist would like it to, it is because actually there's a unique Mormon ideology that is somewhat separate from the governing Jacksonian American populist thing. It sort of, it makes this a little bit of a unique wrinkle, but also a revealing one in certain ways, because you're seeing the fracturing and the diversity actually within American conservatism and things like that. So you had, as you mentioned, a lot of ranchers sort of coming in to support this, person by person. I would say there aren't that many public lands ranchers left in the United States. There's like 30,000 of them, and they are mascots. They're mascots for a way of life. Then they know that they're not. They're mascots for a way of life that has largely been destroyed, both by federal regulation, but more so just by their own bad grazing practices, honestly, and by just competition within the American beef structure, which makes it virtually impossible for small people to be ranchers anymore. And so of those 30,000, like, if you are one of them, you know all the other ones. Like, it's not a big world. And so people come in and they would yell at Ammon and say, stop doing this. And some kids would come in and bring a gun and say, I'll die for you. You had, strangely, again, to show the fracturing in all of this, the Stewart Rhodes Oathkeeper types, these huge militias in Southern Oregon, which is an area that after basically federal regulation justifiably, I'm not, everybody I understand why this happened, but in the northwestern United States, the timber business was shut down virtually overnight due to a long-running thing deriving from something called the spotted owl crisis. And that has caused huge economic problems and also huge state functioning problems, because in these regions, they basically funded all those county governments off of timber sales payments on federal lands. There is no federal lands timber industry left in the Northwest anymore. And so a lot of these counties are run by militias, officially or unofficially. And so those militias have huge amounts of political influence. And they sent, a lot of those people came up, but they wouldn't participate because they were like, Ammon has this idea that is actually, we're living through the sweets of this idea right now as we speak today on Twitter. Right-wing people are being convulsed by a fight over whether or not to distribute public lands and sell them off. Ammon supports that. The person putting forward the proposal in the reconciliation bill that is being advanced through Congress right now is a Mormon, Mike Lee. So he's coming downstream from that. But most right-wing people don't support that. They want less regulation on those lands, but they don't want to distribute them. And so those militias showed up, but would not support. And they said that we're going to observe. And if the FBI comes in and Wacos these people, quote, which is to say comes in guns blazing, they were going to fight, but they hung back. So they were, the FBI and the FBI and the militias were back miles away at the Burns airport, just watching each other over a fence. And then Ammon was sort of left the run of the refuge with nothing. I mean, drone surveillance and obviously tons and tons of FBI informants all over, as this sort of crowd would show up every morning and people would come through and he would welcome them. And there were guards at the gates, but everybody who wanted to could just come in. And then there was this sort of shadow force at the airport where like militia spies and paramilitaries and then the FBI headquarters had sort of been set up. So it was not, people have this idea of this whole thing as like, there's a wire and there's a standoff and there's dudes with guns on either side of it. That's not how these things work anymore, because it's just a bad look and it's a setup for danger. So the FBI doesn't risk that.
So, yeah, I mean, I guess we've had Alex Garland's film Civil War presenting one kind of very spectacular, you might say politically perhaps not that plausible kind of conflict within the states. Good film, I thought. But this is very, very different. I guess it's that kind of mutual standoff. The state may be lacking the kind of the solution to this problem straightforwardly, not willing to use the force that would be required for understandable reasons. How does it resolve itself then, if because you don't have this kind of people just peering down the sights at each other, although in the book it does seem like this is there's heavily armed, both sides are heavily armed. Yeah, so how does it kind of resolve itself then?
So yes, and both sides were heavily armed, don't get me wrong. And there's a lot, as much in the FBI as in the militias, like there's just a lot of young men who just want to shoot something eventually. Like they'll say they don't, but of course they do. They're young men who joined an armed group. Like you don't do that because you don't want to shoot things. So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it wasn't tense at times and things like that, but it was just the geography of this was very, very distinct from how you might think of like a standoff outside of a bank robbery or something. And what happened was actually that people would drive. This is 40 miles from the nearest town. This is one of the most remote parts of the United States. And as judged by distance from an interstate, I think it is the most remote part of the United States. And that's Burns, which is the town of a couple thousand that was the nearest town. And then this is 40 miles south into the desert from Burns. So it's high desert, sagebrush. This is a landscape known as the Great Basin. And the Great Basin is an amalgamation of different watersheds that basically have no outlet to the sea. And so the reason this is a wildlife refuge, just so people understand, is that it's the basin below a set of mountains where shallow water pools in summer after the rains and the snow melt. And you have these like brackish little lakes that migrating birds love to visit. And it creates these wetlands in the desert. And that's an important stopover on the Pacific Flyway. And so hence the nature of this wildlife refuge. You're sort of at this desert outpost in these remote marshy lake regions. And I'm saying that because, like, just to give a picture, there are people driving 40 miles from Burns after having driven all the way from Wyoming or wherever they're coming to like come and do, and Ammon would do these like workshops on why the federal government's not allowed to own land, what everybody had, how ranchers have been targeted and oppressed over the years, this kind of thing. And people would sit through these workshops. It's very weird because it's like a violent extremist movement sort of, but then you have like adult education class like throughout the afternoon, and then you have like group lunch. It's like camp, you know. And he did a couple things that were really, I mean, virtually wanton, but really kind of amazing spectacles. So one of them was he went early into the standoff. They hosted a big town meeting in Burns itself at the community center at the rodeo grounds, I think. And thousands of people came out, media blasting, and Ammon himself wasn't there, I don't think, because that would have been at that stage like pretty crazy. But they were testing the waters, and they had these like, people would get up and support them, people would get up and be viciously angry against them. And these towns have been divided over this stuff for years and years, over the mostly the environmental pro anti-federal regulation stuff. And that was a wild, electric event. And I think it gave them inspiration. And then Ammon started going. So he went to Crane, which is sort of a town, tiny little town, but he went to the Crane Hot Springs, which is like one of these classic Western resorts, Pinewood, little shacks and cabins in hot springs. And he gave a talk there, wasn't arrested. And I think he got to thinking like, I'm going to make this thing work. Like, we're going to get these ranchers out of prison. We're going to change the conversation on federal land policy. And this has a lot of backing. So he had a lot of backing from this guy, Forrest Lucas, who's a big Trump donor and who is the founder of Lucas Oil, Lucas Stadium in Indianapolis. If anybody follows American football, is, you know, he owns the Indianapolis Colts, I think. And so Lucas has been sort of aligned with big ag stuff, and they like the idea of selling off public land. So they're sort of like supporting him and sending out people to quote film, but obviously they're supporting it, and it's starting to grow. And so there's these sheriffs throughout the West, they call themselves constitutional sheriffs, that are very much aligned with this kind of like liberty above all ideology. And so Ammon went up to Grant County, Oregon. I think it's Grant County. And he was going to make a new speech, like spread the movement. And there was a sheriff up there that was going to protect him. And he made a caravan to go up there, and the FBI saw their chance. My uncle had just died, so I went to Florida for his funeral, like right before this. Otherwise, I would have been with them. And there was a roadblock. It turned out that Ammon's driver was an FBI informant. And so he just pulled over at the roadblock. And then Lavoy Finicum, who was Ammon's sort of like most diehard follower, and another Mormon, a father of like 15, he took off and fled and tried to get away along with Ammon's brother and this woman, Victoria Sharp, who's like 16, who was a Christian singer who was going to go to their event. And that turned into craziness. And the FBI fired on them after they had crashed the truck. I think it was just an accident, but the FBI fired on them and then concealed that. Lavoy got out of the truck and started yelling, "You have to shoot me, you have to shoot me." And then if you look at the video, I think he did go for a gun, and he had a gun in the pocket where he went for it. I believe all that stuff. I don't believe that he was like, it was a deliberate murder by the Oregon State Police, but he did get out of the truck in response to gunfire that was actively covered up. So it's a very weird and murky story.
Yeah.
And then an Oregon State police officer shot him from behind while he was reaching for that gun.
So, I mean, hearing you recount this, it strikes me how much of a like lost cause it is, and maybe even that's some of the appeal of it, the appeal of the lost cause. I don't know. And I mean, obviously that is perhaps a quite freighted phrase in American history. So it's not necessarily an association I mean to draw, but in any case, you know, like you're saying, oh, his driver was an FBI agent. And like in so many of these stories, there's always that, because the imbalance of power is so obvious, right? And that these guys think they can kind of hold themselves away and still at least stand up to the federal forces. And it seems, at least from the outside, I mean, obviously they themselves, believe that they have something going there. And from the outside, whenever you read accounts of like this, all the way back to Waco or whatever, it's like quite obvious who's going to come out winner. And it seems like the biggest variable in all this situation is the degree to which the feds want to engage in a direct confrontation and gun battle or not. And that seems to be the more decisive factor, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is always this is a drum I'm always banging. And so forgive me, because you probably certainly read this in the book and probably read me banging this drum at other times, but in so much as war, the Clausewitz thing of war is politics by other means, that extends in other directions, right? Politics is war by other means. And in a certain sense in America, because we are an armed society, there just is a continuum between war and politics that is, I think, it's more of a gradient than it is a category difference. And if you want to go back, you mentioned Waco, you think about Ruby Ridge. Well, first of all, Ruby Ridge was an absolute catastrophe for the feds. I mean, an absolute world historical catastrophe for the feds that in a certain way would, if you conceive of the governing bipartisan consensus of America in the latter half of the 20th century that embraced globalization, embraced military power abroad, embraced the American empire and the dollar system and all that stuff. If you conceive of that as a thing that is a organized political project of globalization and the management of this empire, Ruby Ridge was one of the worst things that ever happened to that. Because when they killed him and they didn't kill Randy Weaver. When they killed his wife and child for no reason, I mean, that shook the foundations of this whole thing. And that to this day, listen to Tucker Carlson talk about Ruby Ridge, and reading actually PBS reporters and people who are very mainstream who looked at Ruby Ridge and went, oh no, this didn't need to happen. Seeing how then that moved into mainstream conservative circles, and then the mainstream conservative circles going, oh wait, there was a new world order. That wasn't fake. Hold on, sorry, these guys were right about that. And then you have people at the highest levels today of American government who conceive of themselves as going to war with the remnants of that new world order. That is, Ruby Ridge didn't cause that, but it did much to foster it.
Fascinating. Yeah.
So I guess just to kind of, for listeners particularly, to summarize, this event, beginning of 2016, if you would you agree with the LA, interrupt me if you don't agree with the LA Times estimate, 40 odd ranchers, some of whom were, as you say, were sheriffs, particular group of sheriffs, around, a month and a bit, one person died, one person injured, 20 something arrested. So, that's the kind of the facts of it. But I guess one of the reasons why I enjoyed the books so much is because it does give an idea of what are the ideas that are animating this group. Because it's a fairly, as Alex's question suggests, it's a fairly radical thing to do, to take on the feds. You're not going to be getting an easy ride. And one thing you mentioned already was Jackson. So Jacksonianism, because I did have a question that frames it a little bit differently, and it's about the West and the frontier. So maybe I can just ask it, and you can sort of come at it from whatever angle makes the most sense. Because I think one of the things that the book sort of suggested, that there is an idea of of America in everything that Americans do, but particularly perhaps the American West. The historian Cheryl Hudson has a book coming out about the history of citizenship in the US. And one of the claims that she makes in this, and that's drawing on Turner, who you mentioned already as well, is that, the frontier is an animating kind of national myth, but the material reality from the 1890s kind of drives of this kind of, abundant land, open opportunity, economic independence. It sort of starts to change from that to a kind of more of a national myth, if you will. So I guess what was the understanding here of that the Bundyites, if that's the right way to refer to them, had of what they were, of how they were being kind of American. Am I just reading too much into it? Was it really the
No,
religion and the Mormonism?
This is how you have to understand. I mean, this is how you have to understand everything in American politics, in my opinion. Like, I just, if you aren't looking back to, if you're looking at Trump today and trying to understand it without looking back to Hamiltonians versus Jeffersonians in the early phases of this republic, like, you are just lost. Like, I mean, you're playing water polo in a kiddie pool. Like, it's just not really serious, in my opinion. And to bring up Jackson, one of the great things that led to Jackson, who was at this time an elected independent state militia leader in Tennessee, one of the early sort of national moments that brought attention to Jackson, of which there were many, was when he was leading a party of slaves back along the Natchez Trace, from Natchez actually to Nashville, through Creek lands that had been, this all goes back to public, everything in America goes back to public lands in a certain way. But the Creek lands west of some line at that time had been reserved for Creek and Choctaw and various native tribes. And they were set aside with a timber cut 20 feet wide that said, like, after this, you need a passport to enter into these lands. And Jackson, in a thing that is very similar to Ammon Bundy today, was stopped by a federal agent who asked for his passport, and he supposedly whipped out the Constitution, said, "I have my passport right here. It is the only passport I shall ever need." Then he threatened to burn the inspector's cabin to the ground, threatened to kill him, and screamed, my God, men, are we free men or are we slaves?" And this was reported across the nation. And this was a thing up to this day. Are we free men or are we slaves? This has always been their thing. But the reason that this is important is that Jacksonian ideology, in so much as this, no one thinks of it like this, but it's a part of your like core civic religion in certain ways. If you come from certain parts of the United States, it's not purely like ethnic Scots-Irish, don't get me wrong, but it derives from a cultural ferment that arose in the largely Scots-Irish uplands of Appalachia after people had come, when most of the land was taken in the good, fertile lowlands pre-revolutionary. And you had first the proclamation of 1763, the crown saying you can't cross the Trans-Appalachian. And then you had actually the United States government trying to restrain people. And Scots-Irish people said, absolutely not, and poured forth through the Cumberland Gap and into the Ohio Valley. And that was all your American sort of country music, everything that comes out of there, the ballads of Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett and everything, comes out of that ferment of people who surged forth across. And Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin were all very, very clear that the point of those public lands was that they were a means to devolve the means of production to regular people. And that's what this has always been about, is you can have democracy without communism because you can devolve the means of production to regular people, because you genocide all the Indians off of the land and then you can give it away. And in the East, that's super easy because you can make, and people think this is a joke, but in Cincinnati, everyone was self-sufficient on like 5 acres. It was super easy. There was a ton of game. The land is very fertile. You don't need to distribute a lot of land. And so by the time Jackson comes along and says, we're going to really genocide a lot of people, and we're going to make this like very intense state policy of devolution of power down to people and giving them lands and breaking the federal bank so that we can make wildcat capital so you can get a lot of like plows and stuff. Jackson made this an ideology of state power in service of giving little guy opportunity. And by the time you get to his reign, those people, that sort of like lumpen middle America, the progenitors of country music America, if you want to think of it like that, had more opportunity, more opportunity for social advancement, fewer taxes, fewer regulations. Arguably, like if you're them, like you have a better life, like just for the stuff they care about, like, which is not really like longevity. It's more like, can I advance and do stuff? They had a better life than like any broad swath of a national population, like maybe in the history of humankind. And they remember that. And as you moved across the continent, you ran into the West, where you can't do yeoman Jeffersonian farming. It doesn't work. Just ecologically speaking, it's too dry. The land is too arid. The land is too unproductive. And so you had to develop extractive industries. And so that's your timber, your mining. And you had, when I said those ranchers are mascots, the ranchers became the mascots for Jeffersonianism in a land that fundamentally can't sustain a lot of ranchers. Just mathematically, there isn't enough grass for the cows. But it was important symbolically. And you had traces of this war going through the grazing wars, Johnson County wars, between like the big cattle operators and little guys, between wheat and cattle in California, which is like the great Upton Sinclair stuff. And by the time you got to the closing of that frontier you're talking about, I would argue actually that we did a couple of things that were very, very sophisticated and that happened at a very high level in American thought. And first of all, people recognized that a closed frontier was not going to work for this people. And people in the United States Senate, people in the United States State Department understood that very clearly. And they said, we're going to go fuck up the Philippines. We're going to go open markets all across the world because that's what we're going to have to do. And we developed an internal frontier, which was these public lands that are now so much at issue. And so what happened was actually, Gifford Pinchot talks about this, like we are going to have to maintain an internal frontier, an internal bank of these resources, and a place for the people who really, really are attached to that working on the land Jeffersonian ideal to go. And we will manage a system of multiple use under which we conserve the nature so that everybody can go and experience that and be wild. And a certain kind of hardcore person who needs this can go and mine and ranch and log on them. And this was developed for that express purpose. This is not just like it looked like it. This is in the document record. And so the thing that a lot of people don't get is that the hardcore Mormon ideology goes farther beyond like the normal rancher ideology, but they're of a piece in that how they see restrictions on multiple use on public lands is actually, it is socialism because it is the federal government basically coming in and instead of facilitating their productive use such that you are devolving power down, giving them the means of production so they can do their yeoman thing, you are managing it out of existence. And that is like the most fundamentally core anti-American thing in their minds that you could possibly ever do. It runs contrary to the entire point of federal power. And so that's why this stuff gets into people's heads and turns in war, because to them it is no less deep than like a sort of like slavery versus free kind of ideology. These are the core American issues.
That's very well put and quite clearly framed. I wanted to ask a little bit more about Mormonism and maybe to tack on to that. The Netflix show American Primeval, which I imagine that you're familiar with it, whether you've watched it or not, notably hugely popular in the US, actually not so popular with critics, but hugely popular in the US and globally. It was actually like one of Netflix's #1 shows in like 27 different territories or something like that. So not just in the US does that story, and this is the American Primeval deals with the American frontier and specifically with Mormons and on the frontier. That has an appeal well beyond just the borders of the US. And I wonder if you have a take on why that is. The frontier may function, of course, as a metaphor for some people where land conflicts and the politics of land are not so central. I mean, in Western Europe, it's not very much a consideration. Here where I am in Brazil, it is quite a bit. In fact, the kind of Bolsonaro supporters are, or Bolsonaro draws his strongest support in those states where there's very much a sense of a frontier. So, these things vary according to where you are. But, this show is popular, like really around the world. Anyway, I wonder if you have a take on that, and indeed, if you could tell us a little bit more about the role of Mormonism in all this.
So, unfortunately, I actually didn't know that. I've sort of seen that show was popular, but I didn't actually know that it had to do with Mormonism. So I'm gonna fudge, but I think I can.
Yeah, no, but
answer.
I mean, just briefly, there's people going out west on a covered wagon, and then they get attacked by Mormons. The Mormons are kind of the bad guys. They're pretty evil in this show. And they're trying to set up there in Utah, and you've got Brigham Young, the kind of governor of the Utah territory, they're trying to I think defend the territory or get incorporated. I can't exactly remember what their end game is, but of course they're brutal and they attack a bunch of settlers dressed up as Indians to pretend that they're Indians, but they're actually Mormons. Anyway, that's the basic story. But the Mormons are the bad guys. That's the important thing.
Yeah, as they frequently are. And America, it's a big issue in America because like one way of looking at like conservative American politics for the last 150 years, I kid you not, is like trying to figure out how to get Mormons without having Mormonism because like their stuff just like works really well. And to a certain degree, like Mormonism is a kind of like religious formalization of American ideology. Like that, it's like an easy way to understand it. And the divisions within the church are actually they, at least today, certainly reflect divisions within conservative America more broadly. And so the church has become very cosmopolitan and very sort of sanitized, and very everything that the church does in public recently especially is like trying to be as Mitt Romney as possible, inoffensive, mainline, take down the weird, or if you're going to have the weird, make it unpublic. They just let women wear their garments, their special spiritual garments, sleeveless now. It is an incredibly diverse church at this point, much like sort of Bush era ideas that republicanism was going to be multicultural and all that kind of thing. And then you have these people who are like the people from Lavoy Finicum, who I'm going to guess, if Mormons were attacking in that show, there's this famous event called the Mountain Meadows Massacre where Mormons attack Utah. And there was a federal invasion and occupation of Utah, where the Fed troops came in under the pretext of polygamy, but also because Mormons were creating their own Western power base. And because we have years worth of Aaron Burrs and various people who thought that they could set up their own civilization in the American West, there was a federal invasion and a lot of people fled to what's known as the Arizona Strip. And so a lot of people in the Bundy ferment, including Shauna Cox and Lavoy Finicum, who was killed, they're down in the Arizona Strip, like holding on to the hardcore, really holding to their testimony, as Mormons like to say. And that's a huge thing. Southern Utah is similar. There's parts of Southern Utah that are called Dixie because they have a kind of secessionist. It's like Dixie of Utah. They're the hardcore, and they're this blah, blah, blah. So what you saw in the Ammon thing is sort of his emergence as a pole that was very threatening to the church, because he spoke to an ideology that a lot of people in the church share, but that the church itself would love to tamp down because it runs against what the church is trying to do nationally, globally, etc. That said, you can't really tap that down. And this has always been the problem with American conservatism too. Like, we want to be a globalized market empire, but we justify that off of like individual liberty and this sort of native to white Americans. I'm ventriloquizing here, but this is sort of like Native American spunk and ingenuity and all that stuff that derives from these psychopaths who like to go and kill a bunch of Indians and then establish a new town. Like, they're trying to tap off of that energy to then get those people to go like make markets in China and develop iPhones and stuff. It's a very difficult and contradictory set of impulses that people have tried to tap into. The church has done this as well with Ammon, where they need that energy because the church, I don't want to speak to figures here, but look at how much of the world's fresh water the Mormon church controls. Look at how much of look at the largest private owners of gold. Look at the largest private landholders. Like, if and when this thing falls apart, like, you're going to wish you were Mormon. And the Mormons are going to need the Ammons, because that's who, if and when this thing falls apart, you're going to want those hard men, right?
Yeah.
And so
it's I mean,
this is
sorry,
all consonant in a way. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think it's a real energy, the kind of that some aspects of that American self-conception, but it's a dangerous one to for an organization or an institution to try to put any limits on, because this is the frontiersmen are always moving things forward. But I guess to kind of, because there's a lot we want to talk about the present day. So I guess looking backwards, is there anything that strikes you about how it was all reported at the time, or the kind of the lessons that were learned? I mean, does this tell us anything about American media, about American politics at the time, or the distance that we've, I guess, come from 2016, if we're looking back and we see different things to what we could have seen at the time?
Yeah, I mean, I could obviously speak to that for hours.
Yeah, sorry, it was a multi-part
No,
question.
no, no. I mean, the thing is, like, thing is, I like to talk about that. I don't like to talk about it in the context of like, I don't want to make it sound like I'm annoyed, personally, despite the fact that a lot of people did a lot of like not very nice things to me and continue to do a lot of not very nice things to me, honestly, because I wrote that book under the belief that if you didn't understand what this stuff was actually about, it was going to cause far worse consequences than would be caused by actually engaging with it, such that the reality of the movement exhibited, right?
Yeah,
And I believed that about Trump, and I believe that still. And that is a thing that, there was a reason that nobody really read this book when it came out, was because it just didn't, it was written under those auspices and people really didn't like that. And it took me a long time as a journalist to actually, I don't want to say win the argument, but it took me a long time as a journalist to figure out a lane under which you could, in mainstream media, explain how people are thinking without being tarred as being their agent, right? And there is still a lot of very, very crazy vitriol that goes into people trying to tar you as somebody's agent because you understand their way of thinking, right? And it's just incredibly unproductive because it's not descriptive of what is going to happen next. So like,
yeah,
it's just like,
yeah,
it's just not that hard for me to like see what Trump is going to do in a couple weeks from now, just because like I sort of like know the stuff that the people are saying is going to happen. And it's just a very bad way for the American media to operate because they don't, even if you wanted to resist it, they don't really know what the framework for deciding how to do stuff is. And so they're always shocked when stuff happens. And
yeah,
this was a great example of that because you actually, I think you actually sort of like ended up in a weird zone where people like Ammon, who are hardcore libertarians and who are informed by the cosmopolitanism of the Mormon church, are actually like weirdly very not racist. They're other things, but they're not white identitarians just because like they don't really believe borders should exist. And they live in a very polyglot world. They all went on missions. It's just not their thing. And so by understanding specifically this movement as like downstream of like the stuff that happens up in Idaho where there are Nazis, like tons of Nazis just with swastikas all over their faces, but understanding those two things as the same thing meant that you would understand neither. And that became during those years a very dangerous thing to say in American media.
yeah. No, I think it was. Sorry, the question was maybe a bit loaded because in my recollection, it was like white supremacists, Nazis take over this place
Right.
in Oregon, and that's
And
I think
sorry, not to cut you off, but I say all of that just as a way of saying like, what if you actually wanted to know this stuff, the thing that you needed to do is understand why public lands are representative of this broader powder keg over how we do devolution of power and organize a productive economy. And now, in the year 2024, a decision about what we should do to reorder a productive economy against the interests of the paper and email class is the broadly speaking organizing principle of a movement that is attained like quasi-revolutionary power in this country. So if you just weren't thinking about that and you were just thinking that they were all Nazis, that's fine. There's a ton of Nazis. I'm not opposed to that. But this was a lens into seeing this older Jeffersonian thing that has now resurged into the absolute seat of power. And people just miss that.
So actually, just to build on that, because I was going to ask how Bundyism relates to the contemporary right, and maybe you've kind of started, I guess, explaining this a little bit. But yeah, just to lay it out, do you think can you see a continuity between the kind of the Bundyites and the and Trump?
Yeah, the thing again, this sort of the other thing that answer was indicating is, people are. This is one of these things that in 2016 I was like, you're gonna miss Ammon when he's gone, because Ammon doesn't share that thing of like we have to fight to restore heritage America. Ammon didn't. Candidly, I don't think he had the historical fluency to look back and say like, what America truly is a war of tribes between the Scots-Irish, the Episcopalians, the Jews, the Germans, various people who came before and after, and blah, blah, blah. Now, today, I don't think Donald Trump understands this, but there's a lot of people at the very seat of American power who really do think on those terms. And like the most important term, in my view, for understanding what's happening in America today is Heritage America, which is a term that was actually invented by an Indian tech founder in 2023 and spread through the right like the most viral meme you've ever imagined.
Did he use it as a term of approbation, or I mean, or
Approbation,
was
yes.
just yeah?
He's pro hair. He's an Indian who believes that America should be set up as a fascist state in the interest of the people who were here a long time. And he thinks that Poles are allowed to come, but like they don't claim ownership the way that someone like I do. That's his, and that's a pretty common view on the right now. That was not true. Whatever you thought of any of this stuff, this was not true in 2014. People didn't even really know about that. People didn't read Albion's Seed. Today, we're seeing right now as we speak, as we talk, like an eruption on right-wing Twitter of people viciously attacking a Mormon guy putting forth the idea of selling public land. So it's a really perfect day to be speaking. But they're doing it through the lens of we are a people who was born on this land. We were forged into a people, as JD Vance said at the RNC. Shocked me. I know JD. I've talked to him about whether he would make this turn, and we went back and forth about this. I have challenged JD in private on this, and I can't really say what he said to me, but I said to him, I was like, dude, I know where because I'm from this culture. Like I can sing. I know every word to every Confederate war song that you can imagine. I grew up around this stuff. I know all of this mythos. I know, I know that thing of your grandfather's buried in this thing, like the stuff that he talks about. And I said to him sort of challengingly, like, you can make a nationalist project that, as in Glasgow during the 2014 referendum, you have like 62% of Pakistani cab drivers voting in favor of independence. You can make a different kind of nationalism if you want. And like, I sort of challenged him to attempt to do so. It is obvious now that that is not the path that they are taking. And it is obvious now that this is a political economic war. I'm not now speaking for JD, but, a cosmopolitan, globally minded elite that is, a lot of them are Jewish, and a lot of Jewish people don't have a fundamental connection to this land that these people talk about. And they don't have that traditional relationship between American WASP elites where there were the Episcopalians over the Scots-Irish. And this was sort of the class divide, but they had a shared interest and background on the British Isles. And there's a lot of people in government today who see that as being the core American high-low relationship that was disrupted by a more cosmopolitan and, Democratic-leaning Jewish-Black alliance, for example. There's a lot of people who say that just straight out.
And so that's that, and that's Heritage America against 20th century America,
post-World War II. Because everything,
all of this seems like such a blast from the past. I mean, to talk, it's not that I think that the history of different Protestant sects is like unimportant to American history or doesn't continue to play a role, but at the same time, to like frame politics in this way seems like, what do you, I mean, to an outsider, it sounds to me like, what are you talking about? How is this stuff? Surely this isn't really relevant. These are just like symbols that people have attached themselves to. It doesn't have any kind of material force in politics.
But this is the thing. So this is an entire argument. You want to understand that, like, in a real level. So after World War II, the West developed an ideology geared around using sort of, and I'm again ventriloquizing, but using the Holocaust as mythos to basically like make sure that the French and the Germans and the Heritage Americans and all these would not organize along ethnic lines ever again. And even many people who share this way of thinking would agree that at that time that was a good thing. And then it became this sort of like, in their view, like zombie brain dead globalism that lasted for however long it has lasted. And then it has run out of rope. And like now the 80 years between 1945 and in 2025 became a kind of like weird liberal dreamscape under which the realities of that which forms the American nation were obscured. And now quite explicitly, the plan is to just sort of like take that block of time and set it aside and say, whoops, and now let's get back to being Americans. And that is a very weird thing to explain to a lot of liberals, because they don't even understand like what you have to read like a lot of books just to even be able to have that conversation or understand why someone would view it that way. And so it's a real fighting with one hand behind the back thing, because people are like, wait, like, well, are you guys populist or something? Like, it's just not even, they're not even like equipped with the rhetorical firepower to talk in the ways that like people on Twitter talk on right-wing circles constantly now. They talk about stuff like this all the time. And like Martyr Maid talks about this. Their whole thing is the post-World War II ideology is now being upset. That is the thing. Yeah.
So, I mean, it's a point that I actually made on this podcast recently. So, I mean, at least analytically, it's something that I'm on the same page with, even if I very much don't share Martyr Maid's politics or people like that, that world is falling apart. Now, my interpretation would be that this has provided, and the kind of waning of American unipolarity, the crisis of legitimacy for the post-World War II American state, and not just American state. Of course, this is a story across the West, but remaining with the United States, that the collapse of that order has allowed people, allowed to kind of opened up a space for people with alternative views. This has mainly been mobilized and capitalized upon by the right, who've then gone and sought out these intellectual and political resources in a pre-World War II past of the frontier. But it's not like, oh, the frontier still exists or something, or it's a continual force. I mean, this is my interpretation. I mean, you can come in and say, no, you're wrong. But it seems to me more like there might be people who can trace a continuity, like familial kinship or whatever, back to that past, and of a kind of, whatever you mentioned, Albion seed, tracing that back to kind of these conflicts which happened in Britain in the 17th century and are still somehow, relevant to the US in the 21st century. But that's a limited pool of people, but they appeal to a much wider group of people. But they appeal to them on a symbolic basis of going, hey, these are the things that we're using to understand ourselves. But really, it's much more about the breakdown of legitimacy today rather than something to do with the past. That's my interpretation.
Well, yeah, I don't know if I think that's true. I think that what has happened in the United States in recent years is like there's a certain kind of breakdown of what I call like Garrison Keillor America, which is like the kind of, I don't call it that. I coined that term.
You'll have to explain that reference.
I coined that term just now, and it's a very obscure one, but I don't know why I said it that way. But I mean like a kind of liberal core of people coming out of that Heritage America thing where they like know some of the Civil War ballads and they know the old hymns and then the mainline Protestant thing, but they're like liberal and they were excited about Obama and that kind of thing. A sort of like middle core under which like that American nation continued through the post-war ideology and to some degree embraced it while retaining some of the history stuff. There was something that happened in the last 20 years where that just like completely blew up. Like that was, you had to pick between Heritage America or not. And what has been really disarming, I think, for the left is that if you try to understand this on a class basis, there's been generations of people trying to understand America's divide on class bases, and they don't work because our fundamental divisions are not class-based. They are Hamiltonian versus Jeffersonian. They are the Albion seed tribes, things like that. And they are unique to America, even. If you're British, I mean, this is crazy, like, right? Like, we never had, in any appreciable sense, a transplanting of the sort of like the Jacobite wars, the wars of religion on the islands of Britain. We didn't, everything in America is called Cumberland. Like it was already set. If you came over here and you were Irish, then you put that behind you and you went through the Cumberland Gap with everyone else. And over here, like there was no Bonnie Prince Charlie, there was no Jacobites, that was over. These are organic to this continent. And that just, if you have an internationalist, class-based, Marxian informed worldview, and you're trying to study American politics, it can be maddening, I think. I'm actually like, I'm very sympathetic to that because I think it's a very descriptive worldview for many things. It's just not very descriptive for like what's happening now. And
Yeah, or if you're trying to force it too much into rigid boxes, then it might struggle. I had this argument actually on Twitter with Daniel Bessner, who's previous guest on this podcast, about this, who was saying, left versus right
whom I
was
like a
never a
lot.
good way.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we have great discussions together, but we disagreed or kind of had different interpretations of something, which was that left versus right, his argument, left versus right no longer applies in the US and never really did apply, and we need to interpret things in different terms. And probably Jeffersonian versus Hamiltonian, or Jacksonian versus Hamiltonian, would be one of those polarizations that you can understand the US through. But my argument was like, look, whether that's true or not, the fact of the matter is more the contemporary global crisis and the end of political modernity, the period delimited from 1789 to 1989, where left and right had kind of more coherent meanings, now are in crisis everywhere. And so it's more like this is just the American inflection of the global crisis rather than America returning to its roots, or like, all this stuff that happened in the 20th century was just like something like a mistake or a sidestep in American kind of the opening of the American empire to the world and so on. And now it's returning to its roots. And I don't buy that.
Okay, so there's a famous quote, not famous, but a very key quote in the history of all of this. And to bring it to someone who really, really wrestles with a lot of these things, and that I think is relevant to this conversation, is everyone should read The End of the Myth by Greg Grandin, where he perhaps too soon argues that the frontier myth finally closed with the election of Donald Trump. That was finally the moment where it kind of like you kind of ran out of rope with all of this. And the big picture argument that Grandin is making, and one of the key quotes in that history, is Nelson Rockefeller basically extending the frontiers through global capital and the development of what would eventually become neoliberalism, and saying like, I believe that young men are frustrated within these borders. They can't like go pioneer or whatever, but they can go like, become mining magnates who run through Africa and exploit all that, whatever. So then, and Rockefeller at that time was US trade rep to Latin America. So it was very sort of like perfect, you just hit that note and you're like, oh, I see. And I think by any reasonable measure, whether you're pro or anti the ideology that came during this period, you have to understand that for it to work, the thing that like America did really effectively was it basically like solved the classic barbarian versus civilization problem, because you just sent the barbarians, they could go do other stuff. And so you had this like violent energy, this violent, like pushing, like ungovernable energy. And you actually like turned that to the purposes of the state, and you turned that to the purposes of capital. And that was a really, really effective thing America did that virtually no other modern society has ever done. And you're always trying to solve that problem. And then you run into modern statecraft and modern markets and things like that. And you're like, oh no, we got to get rid of the barbarians. This doesn't work anymore. And the barbarians are like, no, we're not going anywhere. And suddenly you have a problem. And to the extent to which, like going back to Ruby Ridge or the Ammon thing, it is an attempt by the state to just corral the barbarians and just give them enough time to fade out, blend in, go away, get rid of all of this, and have us settle down to being a normal country. That's why killing them is such a bad idea, because every time you kill one, you birth 5 new barbarians. The whole point was to like just let it simmer down. And I think what we ran into was that failed. And like now America has to like go conquer Greenland because we don't know what to do with these people. And so I talked about this with Ezra Klein, who was very fascinated by like the Trumpian plans to conquer Greenland and whatnot. And he was like, so is this just a thing? Like men need something to go do? And I don't necessarily think men writ large do, but there's a part of America that nobody's figured out how to deal with where that remains an issue. And that's why like it's so important that we do have public land, because you can give those boys something to shoot, which is elk, and like they can go do that.
Right.
I mean, better elk than feds. Well,
exactly.
Depending on your position on feds, I guess.
That is at a high level. That is literally what people should be looking at. I don't know a lot of people in the Obama administration who were thinking on those terms, but that is how you need to think about these problems.
Right. So one more question. I mean, I actually had so many other questions as well emerging from this. I think, there is no frontier. We live in total capitalism, and this is to an extent illusory, this idea of frontier. And I say that living in a country which probably has much more of a claim to have an active frontier than the US does.
For sure.
In Brazil. So anyway, but
there's no frontier in Britain. I can confirm.
Yeah,
Surrey
exactly.
is not frontier country.
Everything's been fully colonized by capital in deep and wide ways. So anyway, that's we maybe have to do this another time. What I did want to ask specifically is that in the last in the last 8 months or so, you've had several pieces out on MAGA, on Bannon, on that whole ideology, and indeed on ructions, foreseeing ructions, and indeed talking about active ructions within the Republican Party and within MAGA, within America First, and so on. So I want to ask about that. I mean, the first part of the question is hearing your depictions of Heritage America and some of the thought around there, and particularly the kind of, I said lost cause earlier, and it wasn't kind of on purpose.
A very charged term in American politics.
No, a very charged term.
Yeah.
But now I'm using it. But now I'm using it deliberately, right? Now I'm using it kind of because to a certain extent, and I don't mean to refer exclusively to kind of pro-Confederate ideas and groups, but maybe more generally, because the kind of these frontiersmen who are going to inevitably lose out against the feds are kind of holding to a romantic idea and perhaps a romantic defeat, which they maybe are quietly or tacitly aware of, that they're going to lose, but they need to make this stand. I don't know. Maybe I don't know if you agree with that, but in some ways, and I don't want to endorse these terms. I'm using them merely descriptively, but that the conflict between, for example, some of these like Heritage America, MAGA nationalists, national populists, and the kind of libertarian high-tech accelerationists of Silicon Valley, who are part of the MAGA coalition or part of the Trumpian coalition, are at odds with each other. And to a certain extent, you could frame this as people who are losers. I don't mean to, again, I'm not calling them losers, but hold to an idea in some sense of to hold to an old ideal which has maybe been defeated at some romantic idea, and the others who hold to the notion of being winners and whose only purpose in life is to be on the side of the winners and to this ideology of success, of entrepreneurship, and so on. And is that a credible way of framing this opposition, or
Well, arguably, we're seeing the question of who's winner and loser here play out in real time. And to some degree, the answer, I think, is trending towards one that would surprise people. And so, I didn't put this in the original Times piece that I wrote that sort of sketched this divide that I anticipated coming to a head and did some months later between the Heritage America group and the tech right. And the thing that people were really bouncing up against was this thing of the Heritage America people were like, yeah, you guys come along for the specific reason. I'm not interpreting this. This is not some kind of I'm drawing a metaphor here, for the specific reason that the tech guys were giving them a new frontier, go to Mars. This is that we are a pioneer people, and the next stage for our pioneer people is Mars. But they're instrumentalizing the tech people as far as they understand it, as far as if they're really, really able to win and decide things how they want to do it, they will instrumentalize the tech people to beat China and send us to Mars, but have their core interests as a Heritage America be the shaping thing that governs everything. And when those things come into conflict, what are they going to choose? They're going to choose the Heritage America stuff. And we are seeing that happen. We're seeing that they turned against Elon. They fought bitterly. They said, that's fine. You want to grow our GDP by importing talented Indian tech workers? Our choice is lower GDP. We don't care. We don't care. And the thing is, so when I was saying they're losers, are they? Because I think it's an unsettled question. And I think what you are seeing right now in all of the divides, in the Iran stuff, the tech right, Elon stuff, and then indeed I'm harping on this public lands thing, partly because it's something I personally care about, but partially because I actually think it's more revealing than some of the stuff that gets more coverage. Because you have a lot of people on the tech right, not just the market absolutist, Cheneyite, brain dead neocon kind of right, but a lot of people on the tech right who are like, there's all this land, let's develop it. And like people have said to me, I've done interviews across the spectrum on this, where like people in tech right stuff will say like, well, it just doesn't matter about the elk because we have to beat China and develop and like keep our GDP going. And the problem is that the tech right actually shares a fundamentally liberal modern ideology and a liberal modern way of understanding the world, which is that people will act in their rational economic interests and should act in their rational economic interests such that it develops and gives you a better functioning society and all that stuff. The core of MAGA does not believe that. And the core of MAGA does not believe that the thing that gets people out of bed in the morning and causes people to act in concert together to do things is rational economic interest. It's national interest, it's spiritual interest, it's things that go beyond the conceptions of both, you know, a Marxian derived left liberal ideology and a sort of like what you might call right liberal neocon ideology. And the thing is, like, that's why I keep banging this drum about this, is like, if you believe that people are going to act in their rational economic interests and that's what drives societies, you're getting owned all day right now because it just doesn't explain why things happen. It's a bad frame of understanding the world. And that's bigger than anything. That's like why MAGA people are winning right now, because they have a better understanding like what gets people out of bed and gets them to the polls and gets them to give money and all this stuff. And so I'm just saying, you're right. It was a loser ideology for a very long time. For the set off of a block of 80 years, it was a very losing ideology. But the thing that the way that this all ties together, and maybe a good way to wrap this up actually, is that, you know, their argument would be that like Elon's and all these people only even have an idea of going to Mars because of that frontiering American barbarian wild drive push, that kind of thing. And we're not going to beat China by having like a ton more AI swarms than them. We're going to beat China by the things that America has always done. In the ideology, America's always just been soldier for soldier, a way more effective military force. Like, we don't need as many guys because our guys are better. And why are they better? Because they grew up hunting elk and they're wild and they're self-starters and our NCO core. Like, you can listen to Eric Prince. I listened to Eric Prince last night talking to Sean Ryan about this. And he was like, the reason we will win is our NCOs are just going to always be better than theirs. And that is an ideological, quasi-spiritual belief. That is a belief that like you give Sergeant McGilliputty like 7 guys and drop him on an island and he's going to beat 100 Chinese guys because like we're just better. And that is the Scots-Irish thing. That is like how they think, you know, they're a warrior class and all this. So it all actually connects. And like, to me, it's because I come from this enough, like it is really dangerous because it is like a racial thing. It doesn't make sense otherwise. Like you said, England's not a frontier nation. Why? Because when the Normans came, the Normans sealed off the royal forest. They made a royal forest system and they said, you guys can't have this. And the Saxons went wild. That was the revolt of the barons that led to the Magna Carta, was access to forest. They wanted to graze cows on the freaking royal forest and hunt deer, the same stuff we have here. And when that ran out, when enclosure started happening, this is what drove everyone here. Is you have these people who have been like this for thousands of years. You just can't deal with them. And I'm like one of them, so I'm allowed to say this. But you're just not governable people. They're built to kill and go look for elk. Like, you don't. And if you don't understand that that is like a thing that didn't disappear after World War II, you're going to have a lot of trouble understanding America.
All right, very good. I mean, I have to, you know, almost want to ask you like, okay, well, who's going to win out, you know, over Iran, for example? You know, is it going to be the military empire, money, finance people, or is it going to be anyway? But I don't know if you have a quick enough answer to that to let you go.
Well, I think long term, what the Iran thing is really about, and this is really, really hard to talk about, but long term, what the Iran thing is really about is America a country that goes and fucks people up overseas? Because we're always going to be that. And we are going to be an isolationist nation going forward. We're going to go back to the no permanent alliances in some degree, if not in actual form, in practice to some degree. But what that thing is really about is how much sway Jewish Americans have over American foreign policy. Deep down, that's what we're really talking about when we talk about Iran. within this administration. And that is very much of a piece with everything we're talking about. And I'm frankly deeply concerned because I think it's already pretty ugly. I think if you read between the lines, you can see that there's an ethnic intra-elite competition. There's certain things that people don't talk about that are very clearly playing out right now. And if you understand that in a 1890s sense more than a 1990s sense, it's going to be a little clearer, I think.
Right. Interesting. That's a nice place to leave it, I think. Unless George has anything to add.
No, I have a lot of questions, but just one thing. Hearing you talk there, it sounds like "Make America Great Again" is "Make America Heritage Again." So it should be Malheur rather than MAGA.
I would definitely think that is correct. I think that's a much better way of understanding it. Yeah.
All right. Fantastic. James, we will let you go. We know you have to run off, but thank you very much for being with us. This has been great.
Thank you. This was fun. This was you guys are very smart questioners. So,
we'll have to do this. There's so many other questions that emerge from this. So if you're up for it, we have to do this another time.
I'd love to.
Fantastic.